I was an EMT for a while. We got a call about someone who was riding their bike at a breakneck speed when they hit a car head-on first without a helmet. We went over immediately. Despite the fact that it was broad daylight and we were in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday, nobody even came to check on this poor guy. Seriously, the streets were empty. Usually a massive crowd gathers around violent accidents like this, so his skull was pretty much smashed in, and he was unresponsive. It was the worst head injury I'd ever seen. We assessed that he had a major skull fracture, a concussion, and he was bleeding profusely. He was also missing teeth and had a minor road rash, but fortunately he wasn't missing much skin. To give you an idea of how bad it was, this was the kind of injury that most people don't survive. If you did survive, you'd basically be a crippled vegetable. Normally we would have moved him off the road, but when someone has a head neck injury that isn't very safe, my partner, who was also training me as I was still kinda new, went to check his pulse while I began to unload our gear. He crouched down, felt for a pulse for a while, and then stood up and opened his mouth to say something. Suddenly, the guy jumped up. He didn't use his arms to pick himself up, he just jumped to his feet. It startled the two of us. He looked at us, smiled, and attempted to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we didn't exactly want to wrestle him to the ground given his condition. He gets away from us and bolts into the woods without his bike. My partner was in even more disbelief than I was. He just stared at where the man had run off, mouth agape. Then he turned to me and muttered, "He had no pulse, man." I asked him if he was sure, and he swore up and down that the biker was clinically dead. We contacted the authorities for assistance, and they sent a search and rescue team into the forest. I don't know if he was found or not, because we normally don't get much information about patients after they go to the professionals. My best guess is that he went to a loved one's house out of confusion. What I found odd about that is, head injuries bleed like hell, so you'd think the guy would leave a long red trail of blood for the cops to follow. I am a 911 dispatcher. I'll always remember Mr. Blue, the nicest old man living kind of out in the middle of the desert. He was tagged in our system of having dementia. We used to take calls from him nearly every night about how his wife's dolls would come to life and torment him, or how his wife was kidnapped by them. Might I mind you, she passed away. So it seemed that every time he would call was right around my shift, and I just so happened to be the one to take his calls most of the time. It was a little creepy being on the phone with him at times. He would randomly shush me, and you could actually hear footsteps. Or he would explain that there was somebody living in his couch that he could hear laughing. Nicest old man, and you never want to deny them. So I'd stay on with him and talk to him about his life until the deputies arrived. Mr. Blue doesn't call in anymore, and I have no idea what happened. I've been in law enforcement for nearly 6 years, and I have had a few supernatural things occur during my shifts. The most recent one came from a 911 hang-up call. I was riding two-man on a summer night, and it was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning when we get a call for a 911 hang-up. The only call comments were a call was placed to 911, and upon answering it, the person hung up. When dispatch attempted to call the number back, no one answered. The area in which I was working this night, I have basically spent my whole career in. There aren't a whole lot of streets I had yet to respond to. However, the address this call came in from, they used GPS coordinates to find the closest location since the caller hung up, I had never been to. I had driven past this road many times, but never actually received a call from it. We pull up to this old dirt road, and it has a metal chain going across the entrance with a sign that says no trespassing. Because we have to figure out what is going on, me and my partner continue on foot up this long dirt gravel road. The road was maybe about 100 yards long. The crappy part was that on each side of the road was a tall chain link fence. Why this was crappy was because now me and my partner were now walking down a fatal funnel. If there happened to be a guy waiting for us at the end of this road, with let's just say an assault rifle, we would have no place to take cover. Thankfully, this did not happen. We eventually reached the end of the road, and there are 2 houses on each side. At first, we believe one of these houses is where the 911 call had come from. As I am shining my flashlight at one of the houses, I see a figure move from inside. Instantly, I'm like, oh crap, people actually live back here. As I thought for sure, the houses were going to be vacant. Shortly after, a man and a woman walk outside and ask what is going on. We tell them we received a 911 hang-up call from the address and asked if they had called. The man tells us his address, and the one across the street is vacant. He proceeds to tell us there is a 123 Main Street, which is basically in the middle of this tall forest-looking area just to the north of his house. He says the house is vacant and run down and can only be reached on foot. I ask him how far away it is from his house, and he says probably a couple of football fields away. Now, while all this walking, investigating was going on, we had received 2 more 911 hang-up calls. Same address, same result. Before we made this trek out into the middle of the woods, we called for another car, and eventually another 2-man unit responded. The 4 of us now wandered out into the woods, 2 of us with our assault rifles out, and followed a barely beaten path to where we assumed we would find a house. Fighting spider webs and low-hanging tree branches, we eventually reach our destination. I am terrible at describing things, but this house was straight out of any horror movie you want to imagine. It was run down, had a tree that had fallen through the middle, and had now become incorporated with the house throughout the years. The house was nearly falling apart and was completely overgrown by greenery. Having come this far, we decided to continue on, even though we were pretty sure the house would be vacant. After fighting through some thick brush, we find our entrance. We each have to climb over some fallen brick walls and other wooden stuff before we actually make entry. My biggest fear at this point is this stupid rotten house collapsing on itself and being trapped inside with no one being able to find us. We searched the entire house, and like we thought, no one was inside. And when I say we searched the entire house, I mean the entire house. Nothing was left unchecked. Feeling satisfied, we all climb our way back out of the crap and start heading back towards where the 2 original houses were. As we walk back, dispatch radios us and tells us they received another 911 hang-up call coming from the same address. This time, dispatch tells us they were able to make a call back, and when the person answered, they could hear what sounded like a child playing on the phone. The 4 of us looked at each other and decided we were done with this call. We had done everything we could up to that point, and were not about to get called back into possibly a demon's house because a child was on the phone. We cleared the call and don't receive any more 911 hang-up calls for the rest of the night. Fast forward maybe 6 months, and it's a dead-ass cold winter. 911 hang up from the same address. This time it's me and 3 guys who weren't there previously. I tell them the story of what happened, and all 3 are super psyched and want to check it out. The 4 of us walk back out to this house, now much easier to get to since the cold had killed off a lot of the greens. The 3 of them decide to go into the house. I wait outside as I already had my fun. They don't make it too far once they realize this house is about to collapse on itself. We all leave again. No callback from a child this time. Former EMT firefighter here. One night we got a call to do a wellness check on someone who dialed 911 but didn't respond to the operator. We pull up to the address, and the house looks perfectly quaint, and a little old lady greets us at the door. We asked her if she knew who placed the call, but she told us that she lived alone since her husband died. We barely got back to the station before a call comes in again, the same address as before. So we drive back out, talk to the old lady again, then leave again, and just as we get back to the station, same call, same address, no response. We drive out there again, believing that the old lady must have been confused. But this time, when we pulled into the driveway, the old lady wasn't at the door to greet us. There was no reply at the door, but it was unlocked. We take a peek inside to find the old lady was on the floor and wasn't breathing. We rushed in to help and got her to a hospital in stable condition. When she woke up in the ambulance, she still claimed that she never called us and that we arrived almost immediately after she had fallen. It was a 15-minute drive to her house from the station. Before she was admitted to the hospital, she asked me and another EMT if we could bring her knitting needles and bag of clothes to her in the hospital. I offered to pick up her stuff because I had a friend who lived in that area and we were gonna hang out anyway. I pick up my friend and drive to the lady's house. I ran inside to grab the bag and knitting stuff while my buddy sat in the car. But just as I was leaving, I swear I felt a hand on my back and heard a voice say thank you. When I get back in the car, my friend asked me why couldn't the lady's husband bring her stuff to the hospital. I explained that her husband was dead, but when I said that, my friend said, "But I saw an old guy in the window." He smiled and waved at me. At first, I refused to believe in anything supernatural, so I called the police and asked them to do a sweep of the house. I thought it was a squatter. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and no one was inside. I later brought my friend to visit the lady. He started describing the old dude who was in the window, but the old lady almost immediately started tearing up and said, "That's my Harold." Worked as a police officer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Back in the 90s, I was patrolling through town in winter. We had several abandoned houses in town, but one seemed to have the attraction of copper thieves, so we were told to keep an eye on it. Drove by it around 7 o'clock at night. Since it sat on a corner lot, I had a clear view of all four sides of the house. As I drove around the corner, nothing looks out of the ordinary. About 2 hours later, I drive by again, and the back door is wide open. I know that the back door was not open when I drove by it earlier. Looking at the snow on the ground around the house, there were no footprints. So I think, what the hell? Call dispatch. Tell them I'm investigating an open door at that address and ask for a county sheriff to start my way. I walk to the open door, pull out my flashlight, and shine it inside. The house has obviously been gutted for the most part. The plaster walls have been torn down, debris piles everywhere. Since there were no footprints in the snow around the door other than mine, and with all the dust on the floor not showing any footprints, I chalk it up to the wind, or maybe the door just opened on its own. I was about to secure the door when I heard a loud thump come from upstairs and what sounded like kids laughing. So I enter the house and yell out, "Police department, come downstairs." More of what sounds like kids playing. I tell dispatch that it sounds like there are kids in the house and start making my way through the kitchen into the living room where the stairs are, all the while cautiously checking the main floor. 2 more times I hear something upstairs, but since I've had no response, I start thinking maybe it's an animal. Still, I hear what I'd swear was kids laughing. I head upstairs, and it all gets quiet. The upstairs is relatively small with a hallway at the top of the stairs that has one bedroom on the right, one straight ahead at the end of the hall, and a bedroom on the left. As I get to the top of the stairs, I hear a thump in the bedroom to the left. I carefully peek around the door, and it's an empty room with a small pile of plaster and wood debris in the middle. No kidding, sitting on top of the pile of debris was a page torn out of a child's book with a picture of a police officer on it. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I got out of that room, quickly cleared the other rooms upstairs, and got out of there. Told dispatch nobody was in the house, locked the back door, and never went back in there again. I remember my father telling me a story of when he was a police officer in New Hampshire. One night, dispatch gets a call from someone reporting to have seen a little girl wandering around a lake by herself. That night, my father was on duty, and every available police officer responded to try and find this little girl. My father was the first to arrive with his partner. As they exit their car, they slowly start to walk toward the lake. As they near the water, my father's partner hits him on the shoulder and points towards the lake. And there stands this little girl. My father said when he turned to see her standing in the water, and every hair on the back of his neck stood up once he saw her. It was 2 in the morning, and in November, so it was very cold outside. He said she was in a white nightgown with no shoes standing in the water. They both look at each other, knowing that something wasn't right about this situation. They report to dispatch that they found the girl. They walk a little closer, and my father kneels down and holds his arms out and calls for the girl to come to him. The little girl then turns her attention to my father and slowly starts to walk towards him from out of the water. As this is happening, another unit pulls up to witness this girl walking up to my father. Just as the little girl is within 8 feet of my father, she disappears, and there was nothing left but tiny little footprints in the dirt. They all stand there in disbelief, trying to figure out what just happened. And one of the police officers turns and says, "How are we going to explain this?" My father was a Boston cop. He told about a memorable call back in the early 90s. He got a domestic call. Cops hate those where, when he showed up, the man who called was waiting outside covered in blankets, shivering to death. On a hot day in the middle of August. Apparently, he angered his woman, and she responded by making a voodoo doll and chained and padlocked it in the freezer. The man wanted the cops to break the fridge open, but they weren't going to destroy property over this, so they sent him to the hospital. My father said this guy's teeth were chattering, and his lips were turning blue when it was sunny and 80 degrees out. I had a call to a residence for a mental evaluation. Anyway, I get there and speak to a 50-something-year-old woman who states her 20-something-year-old son is under the influence of an unknown drug and kept repeating that he can't go in his bedroom because there was an old man hanging in his room. She stated she was too scared to go in his room and investigate it for herself because he constantly brings over friends that are drug addicts and is unsure if his claims were true or not. I then go speak to the son, who is clearly under the influence of a stimulant. He goes on to tell me that he was told by a spirit to not enter the bedroom because her father, dressed in his military uniform, was hanging in his bedroom. I checked the room out, and of course, nobody was hanging in the room. As I'm in the middle of explaining to the mother that there was nobody in the bedroom, a veteran officer arrives on the scene to assist me. He pulled me aside and stated earlier in his career, he responded to this residence, in that same bedroom, he had to investigate a death of an older male subject. He didn't remember all the details, so I looked it up in our report management system in my patrol car, and sure enough, the officer was correct. The subject who died was a World War II veteran and had dressed in his military uniform and hung himself. In my mind, I always thought that when they purchased the home, possibly this incident was disclosed to them. However, I thought the mother would have mentioned it to me if it had been disclosed to her. She was genuinely concerned about her son and the allegations. A friend's father is a police officer in one of the larger villages of Illinois. He and his partner were working night shift when they were called to investigate a suspected break-in at the local morgue. They arrived to find the custodian waiting for them out front. The custodian said that he'd been mopping one of the corridors and had seen something move in his peripheral vision. He looked up and saw a person quickly cross from one side of the hallway to the other. He couldn't tell much about the person as he'd been turning the lights off as he worked his way through the building. Just a dim outline, but enough to be sure of what he'd seen. He was unarmed, so called the police and stepped outside to wait. My friend's dad and his partner entered the morgue. They started off by calling out to anyone who might be inside. No answer, then began to do a sweep, walking down the central corridor with hands on their guns, checking each room to the side, occasionally calling out for any intruder to show themselves. My friend's dad came upon a room with the light off, pitch black inside. He fumbled for the switch and flicked it. The room lit up, nothing but an empty waiting room for relatives of the dead. He heard his partner call out, "Hey, stop. Turn around." Friend's dad swung back out into the corridor, and his partner had unholstered his gun, was pointing it at the end of the long corridor. He said, "She went around that corner." The custodian said, "She's trapped. No exits that way." They had the custodian lock himself in the waiting room for safety, then advanced down the corridor, calling out to the woman to show herself, that they wouldn't hurt her. This time my friend's dad reached the end first, and with his back to the wall, peered around the corner. The woman was standing by a big gray door. Lights were off here too, so it was hard to see her clearly. But he could see she wasn't holding a gun, and had long fair hair. He stepped out from behind the corner to talk to her, but she opened the door, disappeared into the dark inside, and shut it firmly behind her. He sprinted up to the door and pulled at the handle. Locked. Banged on it for a while and called out to her, but no answer. The door had a deadlock on it, so his partner brought over the custodian to unlock it. They turned on their flashlights to see better. The custodian rounded the corner and faltered a little. "This door, you sure? This door doesn't lock from the inside." The custodian found the right key and carefully turned it in the lock. Click. "We're coming in. Have your hands up." They entered the room, flashlights illuminating every corner. The custodian hit the light switch, and the room lit up. It was empty except for some equipment against the wall, and 2 gurneys in the middle of the room. One was empty, and one was covered in a sheet with what appeared to be a body underneath it. Nice hiding spot. My friend's dad approached, and it was the smell that first spooked him. It smelled like a corpse. He pulled the sheet down, and there the woman lay, straggly light brown hair all around her face. The tag on her toe said she died 4 days ago. Friend's father is a devout Christian, does not believe in ghosts or the supernatural. Even now, doesn't know what to make of this event. I'm a second-generation firefighter. My father spent the latter days of his career as a fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. Our state version of OSHA has to come and do inspections at all facilities. His was no exception, so the OSHA inspectors make their way to an abandoned part of the facility that used to house the criminally insane. The absolute worst of the worst. Serial killers, rapists, cannibals, etc. My father left them with keys and a flashlight because the electricity didn't work. The inspectors were radioing back to my father that they kept hearing talking and footsteps, which was impossible. Not even squatters could move around because each section is isolated with locked doors to prevent escape. Eventually, the inspectors give up and actually flee without finishing. My dad decides to stick around and check the alarm boxes. They didn't. As he is checking one of the alarms, he feels as if someone is watching him from down the hall. As he looks, a shadow forms with a head, shoulders, torso, but no legs and just 2 holes where there should be eyes. My dad noped the hell on out of there. Since the hospital has shut down, it has been on Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, and a myriad of other shows and movies. My dad has been in some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he's ever investigated. Police officer here. Burglary alarm reported to dispatch from a private company. A motion sensor went off in a local business. Usually, the alarms don't send an alert requiring police response unless 3 sensors pick up movement. Usually, we don't respond to these kinds of calls unless a person calls us. Sometimes we don't even respond to 911 hang-ups. So we go, since now 2 other alarms for motion get tripped. Another unit, and I set up a canvas on the building. Nothing strange from the outside. Doesn't appear to have any forced entry. Other units, and I get permission to enter from the building owner. We go in through a side door on this thrift shop. We announce ourselves, no response. We clear the entire 2 stories of a standard thrift shop size, not too big. We don't find anything. Store owner meets us outside with an iPad to show us camera footage. The 3 alarms that get tripped show a faint gust of wind that moves clothes on racks. We just assume it was a draft because it happened to 3 consecutive clothing racks. So the owner resets the alarms, and we leave. 15 minutes later, the store owner calls us and wants to meet again to show us something. Clear as freaking day, as my partner and I were leaving the side door after clearing the building, as a shadow-like figure appearing to wave at us, saying goodbye. Chills hit me. I didn't want to accept or deny it. We occasionally get tripped alarms, and anytime we don't respond to the place, more alarms get tripped until we at least show up. If we show up, we will have like a 6 to 8 week streak without any activity. We think there's something just wanting police friends. We did research, and we can't find anything regarding death or dying in the building. So who knows? As long as it's friendly, it can trip whatever alarms it wants. I still won't go in without a partner. My uncle was the sheriff of a small town in New Mexico. He was the most hardcore person in our family, super straight-laced, and wasn't at all a joker. So when he told this story backed up by my aunt, we all believed it without question. A local reporter named Bob D. would always show up at any major police activity from the police scanner. Big car wrecks, fires, anything worth maybe reporting in the local paper. Everybody on the force knew Bob D. He was around at least once or twice a week at various police activities. Bob was a bit of a joker himself. He would mess with people by flicking behind their ears. People would react to the flicks thinking it was a bug only to turn around and see it was Bob jerking around. Everybody liked Bob. Unfortunately, Bob had bad lung cancer and died pretty suddenly. His wife buried him against his wishes. He wanted to be cremated. For the next couple of weeks after his funeral, people kept talking about seeing Bob at car wrecks, fires, all the same stuff he used to report on. There were 20 to 30 reports like this from civilians and members of the force. My uncle didn't buy it. Until the night he and my aunt showed up at our house, gun drawn, pale as paper. We asked him what the hell happened, and he had to sit down, take his breath, compose himself, and start to outline what happened. Note: this is a guy that I never saw get rattled by anything, he said my aunt, and he was sitting on the couch in their house watching TV. My uncle kept scratching at his ear, over and over. Finally, my aunt asked him what the problem was, and he turned around just in time to see their bedroom door open. Bob D. is standing there in the doorway, clear as day. My uncle jumped up, cussed or something, got my aunt's attention, who turned to see him there too. As soon as they both made eye contact with him, Bob smiled, turned, walked across the living room and out their front door, closed the door behind himself, and was gone. My uncle got control of himself and ran outside. Gun drew looking for Bob, but he was gone. At that point, they ran over to our place. We went over there and didn't see anything, but my aunt and uncle stayed at our place that night. At work the next day, all the guys on the force were giving my uncle lots of "we told you so." People around town said they saw Bob D. show up at police scenes for at least another 2 to 3 months. My dad saw him in our darkroom in our basement with a friend. He was flicking their ears in the dark. During the 3rd month, people that saw him kept saying he was looking worse and worse. My uncle saw him 2 more times, each time confirming he was looking more and more worn. My dad had concluded that he was decomposing and his ghost was reflecting that process. Every time my ear itches, I get goosebumps. Got sent to a business once for a 911 hang-up. Dispatch was able to get an exact extension for us, so we knew where we needed to go inside the building to check to make sure everything was good. When we got there, the building was locked up tight. Middle of the night, so we had dispatch get the key holder to meet us so we could go inside and verify everything was good inside. Once the key holder arrived, we asked whereabout in the building extension was located, and she turned white as a sheet. It would seem the holder of said extension died of a heart attack the week prior in his office, and the number had not been recycled to another office yet. Well, needless to say, we didn't find anything in the building out of place, and the office in question was empty except for the basic furnishings. I was a deputy sheriff for 13 years, and the majority of that time, I worked in a large jail with a big population. I was a team leader of the tactical response team that roamed the hallways and responded to all the emergencies that would arise. Not just fights, but medical emergencies too. We had a set of cells in the admissions area that were isolation cells for the inmates who just got there and were problems, either mentally or physically. I responded one night to a guy who took his pants off and tried hanging himself in the cell. He had to be rushed to the hospital. When we reviewed the camera footage to assist with our report, all you noticed was him standing quietly in the cell for minutes looking at the camera. The camera glitches out, and when it comes back on, he's hanging himself. The next 3 days in the same cell, we had similar incidents. One guy was successful in bashing his head into the wall so hard it killed him. But every time we would watch the tapes, the guy would be standing there watching the camera minutes before the attempt, and then the camera glitches. To this day, cell 3 still freaks me out. Makes me think there was an entity in that cell causing people to hurt themselves. And here, once I had a call at our local mall. Show up, and an 8-year-old was having breathing problems. Her mother, aunt, and cousin had just been caught stealing, and it was late at night. We assumed the breathing problem was stress-induced. Once we got into the back of our unit, she looked my partner and myself in the eyes and said that she lived in a bad place. She said she lived with demons, and I kid you not. As she described the demons, her heart rate plummeted to 90 BPM to 45 BPM in a matter of seconds. My partner and I looked at each other and immediately started trying to lighten the mood and preparing for a code. She ended up being okay. I will never forget that experience. Once we had her stable, police were definitely involved. My medic contacted CPS as well. Not law enforcement, but I am a paramedic. Late summer night responding to a call in a rural area. My partner and I were driving down a winding 2-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. No light of any kind other than the headlights and moon. We're coming up on a sharp right turn when I see a man traveling across the grass from an area of brush. He's moving very quickly and smoothly as if hauling ass on a bicycle. No up and down motion like running. Obviously, I'm pretty confused about a hillbilly on a bike in the middle of the night, but not surprised. He comes to a tree and stops. It's about this time we're driving by him. Look out the window and see a man standing next to this tree with no bike or anything in sight. Just standing there staring at the truck passing by. My hair is standing up. We continue towards the call, and I asked my partner if he had seen that guy. His response is, "Man, I thought I was crazy." I am a certified nursing assistant in a local hospital. One of my patients just had a quadruple bypass, and I went to check her vitals. The room was dim, and the hall was quiet. I'm looking at her, and in the corner of my eye, I see something drop from the ceiling out of nowhere. It makes a big clunk sound, and I turn to see what it could be. There's nothing there. At that moment, my patient looks up at me and says, "My dad's here," passes back out. I finish my job and leave. When I would go to that floor again as a floater, I would hate to go into that room. I'm a CMA, was working the night shift in an Alzheimer's unit. All of the residents were in and out with their lucidity. One lady seemed to be having hallucinations, which were pretty common for those residents. She insisted her husband was there, and she talked to him, scooted over so he could sit next to her, etc. Just generally acted like there was another person there when there wasn't. Her husband, Jim, had been dead for a couple of years. She seemed happy, and there's no point arguing with someone with dementia anyway, so we left them to visit. After a while, she quiets down and says Jim left. Across the hall, the lady in that room turns on her call light. Her complaint: "This man won't get out of my room. We don't see anything," and ask, "What man? Who is it?" She turns to the nothingness beside her bed and says, "Who are you?" Then turns back to us and says, "His name is Jim." First and foremost, thank you for listening and for your continued support on the channel. It is so deeply appreciated, and I greatly enjoy connecting with every one of you. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more unnerving tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Share this video with your friends and comment below. Which of these eerie tales gave you the creeps? I would love to hear your thoughts.